long before the pyramids rose over the sands of Giza, before Athens spoke in marble or Rome marched in iron, there was a land whispered of in ancient tongues, a land between two rivers. This land, known to the Greeks as Mesopotamia, was nestled between the Tigris and the Euphrates, two mighty rivers flowing from the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, winding their way down through what is today Syria and Iraq, before emptying into the Persian Gulf. Here, in the soft alluvial plains of the south, the earth was dark, fertile, and wet with life. Each year, the rivers would rise and fall, leaving behind a gift of silt fine as ash, rich as gold. And it was in this land, nourished by floodwaters and lit by a harsh, brilliant sun, that something extraordinary happened. Humanity began to remember, to organize, to believe. As the last ice age loosened its frozen grip around 10,000 BCE, the climate in this region began to shift. What had once been wild and unpredictable, barren desert one year, violent flood the next, became steadier, warmer, more forgiving. Small groups of foragers, hunters, and wanderers, people who had once followed herds across the open steppe, found themselves lingering longer along the riverbanks. Here, they noticed wild grains growing in abundance: wheat, barley, lentils. These early people did not plan to settle. They were still nomads at heart, but the land was generous, and they stayed just a little longer. In the north, in what is now Syria, sites like Tel Abu Huraira and Muribet show evidence of the earliest experiments in settled life. Clusters of mud huts, fire pits blackened with ash, tools worn smooth by use. These were not yet cities, but they were no longer camps. Humanity was beginning to pause, to plant, to harvest, to watch the seasons return. In the foothills and valleys, the first tendrils of agriculture took root. Wheat was sown, barley was stored, goats and sheep were penned, and a question stirred: what if we did not have to move anymore? Further south, where the Tigris and Euphrates ran closer together, the soil was heavier, richer, but the rains were fewer. Here, the Sumerians would later emerge, but first, the land had to be tamed. Early settlers learned to dig canals, to shape the river's will. They raised embankments to hold back floods, and cut channels to irrigate thirsty fields. In doing so, they learned that the river gave but only to those who organized. Cooperation was now survival, and from cooperation, society began to grow. From around 5000 BCE, scattered farming villages dotted the southern plain. At first, they were modest, simple homes of mud brick, built beside small fields. But with each passing century, the villages grew. Structures multiplied, temples appeared, walls were raised. The land became a quilt of settlements, each governed by families, councils, and in time kings. And the people began to wonder, who commands the river? Who brings the rain? Who shapes the winds and causes the flood? Their eyes turned upward to the stars. They looked to the clouds, to the storms, to the sun's harsh fire. And there, in the patterns of nature, they began to see purpose. They gave name to the forces they could not explain. They shaped myths around the mysteries of creation. And from that wonder, a pantheon was born. The people of Sumer would not worship in silence. They built temples for the gods. They baked clay tablets to hold their stories. They invented writing to record the words of heaven. Theirs would be the first true civilization. And at its heart was belief, not in one god, but in many. Not in the unknowable, but in the familiar. The gods of Sumer looked like humans, felt joy, sorrow, jealousy, and rage. They married, they fought, they created and destroyed. They lived in heaven, but also in the city, in the temple, in the home. They were everywhere. And so begins our journey, through mud and myth, clay and cosmos, into the world's first divine imagination. In the next chapter, we descend into the Pantheon itself, to meet the great gods of the Sumerians, to witness their myths of creation, of law, of life and death, and to hear the first divine voices echo from the clay. Chapter 1. The World Before the Gods, Sumer and its beginnings. Long before names like Anu or Enlil were whispered in prayer, before temples soared and sacred hymns echoed through stone chambers, there existed a quieter world, a world without gods, yet full of wonder. A world of earth, water, sky, and of people slowly learning how to live in one place. This is the story of the world just before the divine emerged. A world where the seeds of civilization were first scattered by hand, where the foundations of faith were laid not with scripture, but with mud, with fire, with the river's gift and its threat. To understand the Sumerian gods, we must first understand the people who imagined them, their lives, their work, their fears, and how their world draw, fertile and volatile, demanded that the invisible be given form. As the great glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, rivers surged, rains returned, and grasses spread. Southwest Asia transformed. Forests crept into open steppe, lakes and marshes formed where deserts now lie, and the once roaming bands of hunter-gatherers began to notice something remarkable. In the hills and valleys of the Fertile Crescent, wild wheat and barley grew thick. Gazelles grazed in great herds, rivers teemed with fish. Here, people began to stop moving not because they were told to, but because the land invited them to stay. The first settlements were modest, round huts of reed and mud, communities no larger than a few dozen people. They appeared in places like Tel Abu Huraira, Muribet, and Jericho. In these early villages, life was fragile, but new. Families gathered around shared hearths, stored surplus grain in woven baskets, and ground seeds with stone tools. They still hunted, yes, but they also planted. Not deliberately at first, but through habit, through instinct. Grains that fell near a dwelling would take root, and the people noticed. They began to gather seeds, then to scatter them, then to tend them. Agriculture wasn't a sudden invention. It was 1,000 small discoveries, stacked like stones across generations. They also began to tame animals. The wild aurochs, massive and dangerous, were slowly bred to be smaller, more manageable. Goats and sheep were penned, pigs domesticated. No longer reliant solely on the hunt, the people began to plan, to store, to stay, and this, more than anything else, changed the course of human history. In the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, the land was flat and open. Rainfall was rare, but the mighty Tigris and Euphrates brought life when controlled, and destruction when not. Unlike the hilly north, where rains could sustain crops, the south demanded engineering, and so the people learned to shape water. They dug irrigation channels with simple tools, constructed levees and canals, diverting floods where they wanted them to go. They organized, not just as families, but as communities. Managing water meant managing time, space, and labor. It meant marking the seasons, coordinating planting, storing the harvest. And in doing so, it brought something new to human life: administration. As the centuries passed, villages in the south became more sophisticated. By 5000 BCE, settlements like Eridu, Lagash, and Uruk began to take shape. Their layouts became more deliberate. Homes were built close together, forming blocks. Streets emerged, some narrow, winding paths, others straight and wide. Public buildings appeared, storage rooms, courtyards, workshops. But at the heart of each settlement stood something else, something taller, stranger, more sacred, a raised platform, and upon it a building. At first, it may have been just a communal storehouse or a shared hall for rituals, but over time, it took on new meaning. It became the first temple. Temples in these early cities were not just places of worship, they were centers of activity, religious, yes, but also economic, administrative, and cultural. They received offerings, distributed grain, employed laborers, and housed the early priesthood. Priests weren't just spiritual guides, they were managers, scribes, scientists. They observed the skies, recorded the seasons, tracked eclipses and stars. And through these observations, they sought to understand the will of the forces that governed their world: the wind, the river, the flood, the sun. The people had no answers, but they had questions, and the priests became those who asked on behalf of all. The world remained uncertain. A bad flood could destroy a year's work. A drought could starve a city. A plague could sweep through a population in days. Fear was part of life. And so the people reached for understanding. They began to shape stories. They saw the wind as more than just a breeze. The storm was a personality. The river had moods. The sun had judgment. The divine was born not from fantasy, but from familiarity. And slowly, names began to emerge. Not all at once, and not in full form, but little by little. An, the sky itself distant, vast, silent. Enlil, the wind that stirred the leaves and leveled the fields. Enki, the water that carved canals, filled wells, and nourished the soil. These names began as whispers, as ideas. They weren't yet gods as we think of them, but they were more than nature. They were the first steps toward mythology. Meanwhile, society itself was changing. With irrigation came surplus. With surplus came specialization. Not everyone had to farm anymore. Some became potters, others weavers, stone cutters, boat builders, metal workers. Markets appeared, open spaces where goods were exchanged. Simple tokens made of clay were used to track trades. A shepherd could exchange wool for grain. A brewer could trade beer for pottery. And again, something profound emerged: the idea of value, of accounting, of symbolic exchange. This would become the basis for writing. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk had grown into the largest city in the world, perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 people living within its walls of homes, temples, workshops, gardens, and public squares. At its heart stood the White Temple, built atop a massive platform gleaming in the sun. It was a place of ceremony, but also of administration. Here, the priests managed offerings, recorded deliveries, and distributed food. They used small clay tablets, on which they pressed symbols with a style of simple pictographs at first. A drawing of a fish meant fish, a drawing of a jar meant oil. But with time, these symbols became more abstract. A picture no longer meant just a thing, it could mean a sound. This was the birth of writing, the beginning of cuneiform, and with it, memory no longer depended on the voice. The past could be stored, copied, read again. As cities grew, so did competition. City-states vied for control of land, water, and trade. Walls were built, armies formed. Kings began to rise not just as war leaders, but as stewards of the god's will. Kingship was no longer just political, it was sacred. The gods, it was said, chose the king, gave him his scepter, placed upon his head the crown of legitimacy. Power and faith were no longer separate, they had become one. The Sumerian world had now fully taken form, a tapestry of cities, each with its own god, its own temple, its own myths, laws, and identity. But they all shared something deeper: a common cosmology, a shared understanding of how the world worked, of how the divine touched the mortal, of how the heavens ruled the earth. And so, from mud and water, from fear and faith, from seed and flame, the first pantheon was ready to be born. In the next chapter, we descend into the Pantheon itself to meet the great gods of the Sumerians, to witness their myths of creation, of law, of life and death, and to hear the first divine voices echo from the clay. Chapter 2. the primeval Pantheon, Anu, Enlil, and Enki. When the world was still young, when cities were mere clusters of sun-dried bricks, and the mighty rivers had only just been tamed, the Sumerians began to name the forces that ruled their fragile existence. They gazed at the sky and perceived a silent, boundless vastness, a dome hanging above all life, endless, still, unknowable. They called it Anu. They felt the wind roar across the plains, ripping through fields, bringing both storm and destruction, yet also movement and vital breath. They named it Enlil. And beneath the soil, in the sweet waters bubbling from the deep, in the streams that carved through reed marshes, they saw wisdom, healing, and the essence of life. This was Enki. Together, these three deities formed the core of the Sumerian Pantheon. The oldest gods, the architects of the universe, elemental powers governing sky, air, and water. They were not distant abstractions. They were felt, feared, and fervently worshipped. Anu was the first, the highest, the most remote. His name simply meant sky, and he was the heavens themselves, not a figure within the sky, but the sky in its entirety. He stood as the father of the gods, the silent witness to all things, above chaos, storm, and time itself, and rarely spoke or acted directly in myth. Instead, he delegated power to others, to Enlil, Enki, and the younger gods. Yet, his presence was always felt. He represented the cosmic order, the backdrop against which all things unfolded, embodying the fixed stars, the laws of the universe, and the eternal, and dwelled in the highest part of the heavens, far beyond the reach of mortals, and even beyond the grasp of most gods. Still, every temple bore his symbol, the horned crown, the undeniable mark of divine authority. In later texts, he was recognized as part of the Inanna, the great gods of heaven and earth, named in his honor. Anu's main temple was in Uruk, a city also sacred to his granddaughter, Inanna. His sanctuary there was called the Eanna, the House of Heaven. Though it later became more associated with Inanna, its name forever remembered the sky god who came before. In many creation stories, Anu was the very origin. He was the god who, with the earth goddess Ki, bore the first generation of divine beings. Anu and Ki were once united, sky and earth bound together. But to create space for life, they had to be separated. It was their son, Enlil, who performed this pivotal act. Enlil's name meant Lord Wind or Lord Air. He was the breath between earth and sky, the invisible force that filled the space Anu had left behind. When Enlil separated his parents, he created the world as we know it, dividing heaven above from earth below. This act of creation was an act of immense power. It set the stage for human life and crowned Enlil as the true ruler of the cosmos. Where Anu was distant, Enlil was immediate. He was a storm god, his voice, thunder, his mood, the very weather. He could be benevolent, bringing rain and wind to thirsty crops, but also terrifyingly destructive, flattening fields, toppling walls, tearing through canals. His temper was legendary. In one myth, it was Enlil who sent the great flood, weary of humanity's noise and chaos. It was Enki, his brother, who defied him to save a single man, Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. Enlil's temple was in Nippur, the undisputed spiritual center of Sumer. Though Nippur never held great political power, it was revered by kings across the land. To rule Sumer, one had to be recognized at Nippur. One had to be chosen by Enlil. This is because Enlil was not just a storm god, he was the god of kingship. He bestowed the me the divine decrees that upheld civilization. Writing, music, wisdom, justice, law, all these flowed from him. He governed not with love, but with law. His symbols were the scepter, the horned crown, and the mountain. He was the god of rule, and his word was fate. Despite his fearsome nature, Enlil was not heartless. In myths, he fathers many gods, helps order the heavens, and drives out chaos. He was unpredictable, yes, but also utterly necessary. The world could not exist without air, without breath, without the storm that clears the dust and brings the rain. If Enlil was law, Enki was wisdom. If Enlil governed from above, Enki worked quietly from below. His domain was the Abzu, the fresh underground waters that flowed beneath the earth, wells, springs, rivers, and the oceans of thought itself. Enki's name meant Lord of the Earth, but he was far more. He was the god of craftsmanship, magic, healing, and creation. He was clever, kind, and often mischievous, the problem solver of the Pantheon, the god who always found a way. When the gods grew tired of laboring to maintain the earth, it was Enki who created humans, forming them from clay and divine blood. When Enlil decided to flood the world, it was Enki who whispered the warning, who instructed Ziusudra to build a boat, saving life from destruction. Enki was also the keeper of the me, the sacred powers that governed all aspects of life. In one famous myth, Inanna tricks him while he's drunk, carrying the me to Uruk, taking with her the powers of kingship, music, weaving, love, war, and truth. Enki awakens, realizes his loss, and despite her trickery lets her go, knowing the cosmic order must continue. His temple was in Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Sumer, often considered the birthplace of civilization. In Eridu, Enki's temple rose beside a marsh, its walls adorned with images of flowing water and fish. His symbols were the goat and the flowing vase. The streams from his jar represented the life-giving Tigris and Euphrates. To the people, Enki was not just a god, but a guide, the architect of life, the one who understood the deep logic of the world. Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Sky, air, water, the cosmos, the breath, the wisdom. They were not the only gods, but they were the absolute foundation. They set the world in motion, defined its rules, and created the space for all the others, for Inanna, Nanna, Utu, and Ereshkigal. They were the great powers before the world took its final shape. And though kings ruled cities and priests held knowledge, it was these three who stood above all, watching, shaping, correcting, commanding. In the next chapter, we turn to the most dazzling, dangerous, and beloved deity in the Sumerian world, Inanna, goddess of love and war, of fertility and fury, of the heavens and the underworld. She was the storm within the heart, the flame of passion, the spear of vengeance. And her myths full of seduction, conflict, and resurrection are among the oldest and most captivating stories ever written. Chapter 4. Temples and Divine Cities. How the gods were housed. Long before spires pierced the sky, before cathedrals echoed with choirs, before minarets rose above marble courtyards, the first temples were built of mud. Simple, sun-baked, yet heavy with profound meaning. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians built their cities not around palaces or bustling markets, but around temples, because to them, a city was not merely a place to live. It was a place where heaven touched the earth. At the very heart of every city stood the house of the god, a sacred center, a cosmic axis, the meeting point between the human and the divine. The Sumerians called their temples meaning simply house. But these were no ordinary dwellings. They were palaces for gods, grand estates built not to shelter mortals, but to host the eternal. Each city, a city-state, had its own dedicated patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Nippur revered Enlil. Eridu was sacred to Enki. Ur was home to Nanna, the moon god. The city was certainly the domain of the people, its fields providing sustenance, its walls offering protection. But in a deeper, more fundamental sense, the city was understood to be the domain of the god. And the city ultimately served the temple. Every aspect of civic life, from water management to warfare, was intertwined with the divine will believed to emanate from these sacred dwellings. These temples were always built on elevated platforms at first, just simple raised foundations designed to protect the sacred structure from the annual, unpredictable floods. But over time, with each rebuild, they grew taller, wider, more imposing. They evolved into something truly iconic, something uniquely Mesopotamian, the ziggurat. These stepped towers, rising in tiers toward the heavens, became the hallmark of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. Each successive level was often painted a distinct color, white, red, black, or even blue, shimmering under the brilliant desert sun. At the very summit, often shrouded in mystery and accessible only to the highest priests, sat the temple proper, a small, elegant sanctuary. It was believed that the god descended from the heavens to reside within this temple at the top, just as a king would ascend a throne. To climb the ziggurat was to embark on a symbolic journey upward through the layers of the cosmos, from the dusty earth, through the atmosphere, to the very abode of the divine. The best preserved ziggurat we can still witness today stands proudly in the ruins of Ur. Built for Nanna, the moon god, its massive base still stands solid and solemn beneath the relentless desert sky, a testament to ancient ambition and devotion. But long before that, at Eridu, the earliest known temple rose from the marshy lagoon. Here, more than 7,000 years ago, the people built, tore down, and painstakingly rebuilt the same temple on the same sacred spot not once or twice, but 17 times. Each rebuild was slightly larger, more refined, more perfectly aligned. This wasn't just construction. It was an extraordinary act of devotion, layered across centuries, a sacred memory preserved in the very clay from which it was formed. It's crucial to understand that Sumerian temples were not places for congregational worship as we might understand it today. The average Sumerian did not, and could not, enter the inner sanctum. That space, dark, small, and profoundly holy, was reserved for the god alone, and for the highest echelon of the priesthood. There, within the most sacred chamber, stood a statue of the deity. This was no mere idol or symbolic representation. To the Sumerians, this finely crafted statue, often adorned with precious metals, rare stones, and intricate details, was the living presence of the god on earth. It was believed to be the vessel through which the divine being manifested and interacted with the mortal world. And because it was the god's very presence, it required constant, meticulous care, just as a human ruler would. Each day, the statue was ritually washed and dressed in elaborate garments. Fresh, lavish meals, the finest cuts of meat, freshly baked bread, sweet fruits, and cool beer were placed before it. Perfumed incense would fill the room, its fragrant smoke rising like prayers. While the physical food was consumed by the priests after the ritual, the spiritual essence or breath of the offering was believed to be taken by the deity. To neglect the god's care to allow its hunger or its garments to be soiled was to invite cosmic disaster, drought, disease, or even military defeat. The well-being of the city was directly linked to the well-being and contentment of its divine patron. Surrounding the inner sanctum of the temple were bustling courtyards, extensive kitchens, vast granaries, and countless storerooms. The temple was not only a holy place, it was the indisputable economic hub of the city. Temples owned vast tracts of fertile farmland, employing thousands of people, farmers, weavers, brewers, shepherds, scribes, and artisans of every kind. They stored grain from the harvests, distributed rations to their workers, and managed intricate networks of contracts and labor. In a very real sense, the temple was a powerful corporation as much as it was a sanctuary dictating much of the city's economic rhythm, and its ledgers were written in clay. Thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets have been unearthed from temple archives recording everything from minute barley transactions to immense wool quotas, lists of laborers, and inventories of goods. These tablets reveal a world where the sacred and the practical were not separate spheres, but intricately woven into a single, cohesive tapestry of existence. Temples were also vibrant centers of technology and craft. Musicians performed ritual hymns in the courtyards, their lyres and drums echoing through the sacred spaces. Metallurgists forged tools and elaborate items for offerings. Potters shaped countless jars for oil and wine. Artisans carved intricate votive statues, tiny stone figures of worshippers, often depicted with wide, staring eyes, fixed in permanent awe. These statues, sometimes inscribed with simple, heartfelt prayers like, "May I always be in your presence," were placed in the temple to perpetually pray on behalf of the person who commissioned them. In these temple precincts, music, mathematics, writing, and early forms of science developed side by side. The profound need to honor the gods drove innovation. Calendars were meticulously refined to determine proper ritual days. Lunar cycles were tracked with astonishing precision for festivals. Stars were observed not just for omens, but to understand the patterns of the cosmos. Geometry was used to plot precise temple layouts and to accurately divide vast tracts of land for cultivation. The divine called for structure, and that structure, in turn, gave rise to a deep wellspring of knowledge. Temples also served as crucial repositories of tradition and knowledge. Within their thick mud brick walls, the great myths were composed and recited. Hymns were sung, meticulously passed down through generations. Legends of gods and heroes were inscribed onto clay. The stories of Enlil, Inanna, Enki, and Ereshkigal were not just tales to entertain. They were liturgies, lessons, and vital maps of meaning. Priests preserved them not simply as historical records, but to constantly remind the people of their place in the grand cosmic scheme, to explain why the rivers flood, why crops fail, why kings fall, and why death must inevitably come. The temple, in essence, was the towering voice of order in what was often a chaotic and unpredictable world. But temples were not always peaceful places. Sometimes they were looted, their precious statues smashed, their treasures plundered during times of war. To conquer a city was, in a very real sense, to capture its god, to assert dominance over its divine patron. To steal a statue from the inner sanctuary was a profound act of humiliation, a symbolic severing of the link between a people and their protecting deity. Yet, despite such devastation, the temple was always rebuilt. Always, the god was believed to return. This cycle of destruction and restoration mirrored the mythic cycles of death and rebirth so deeply embedded in Sumerian belief, particularly in the story of Inanna's descent and return. It reinforced the idea of an eternal, resilient cosmic order, even in the face of human conflict. And so, when the people of Sumer looked at their cities, they did not see only roads, homes, and markets. They saw a sacred landscape. Each temple was a beacon, a shimmering point of divine presence. Each ziggurat was a bridge reaching from the earthly realm to the celestial. The gods were not just in the sky. They were there in stone, in brick, in statue, in palpable presence. A city without its god was not a city. It was a corpse, a place devoid of divine protection and meaning. And a god without a temple, without a home, was a wanderer, its power diminished, its connection to humanity weakened. In the next chapter, we enter the living rituals of these sacred places. We will walk alongside the priests, smell the incense, hear the ancient chants, and see the offerings laid before the altar. We will explore how the Sumerians kept the divine balance each day through practice, prayer, and sacrifice. The gods had homes, but they also had needs. And it was the profound duty of humankind to fulfill them. Chapter 5. Rituals, Priests, and Sacred Duties. In the ancient land between two rivers, life moved not by chance, but by ritual. Temples, built from sun-baked earth and adorned with sacred meaning, rose majestically. Within their mud and stone sanctuaries resided the gods themselves. Every rhythm of Sumerian existence, from the simplest daily chore to the grandest state affair, pulsed with deliberate ceremony and profound reverence. For the Sumerians, the divine was no distant, abstract concept. It wasn't locked away in some far-off heaven, aloof and unconcerned. The gods lived among them, in the bustling streets of their cities, within the intimate confines of their homes, even in the subtle whispers of their dreams. They were powerful, yet relatable, possessing passions and temperaments akin to humans. And just like any honored guest, especially one whose moods could swing from benevolent generosity to terrifying wrath, the gods demanded constant, meticulous care. They needed sustenance, music, lavish offerings, and unwavering attention. This devotion wasn't symbolic or metaphorical. It was a daily, material, and absolutely essential practice. The very survival of the city, the abundance of its crops, the existence of its people, depended entirely on keeping the divine order intact. This intricate cosmic balance, they called me a system of sacred, immutable principles that governed every conceivable aspect of existence. There were me for kingship, for marriage, for truth, for weaving, for lamentation, and even for building boats. Everything from the grandest cosmic law to the most mundane human act had a me, a divine blueprint, a fundamental order that had to be upheld. And it was through ritual that these invisible threads were not just maintained, but actively woven into reality. Rituals didn't just reflect the world as it was. In a profound, spiritual and practical sense, they held it together. At the heart of this sacred enterprise stood the priests and priestesses, not prophets or moralists in the modern sense, but divine technicians, highly trained, unyieldingly disciplined, possessing encyclopedic knowledge of offerings, incantations, sacred music, and celestial timing. They knew how to wash and clothe the gods, how to strike the lyre string to evoke the proper melody, how to burn herbs in perfect sequence. Every movement exact, every word precise, because mistakes in the presence of the divine weren't just improper, they were dangerous. A forgotten word, an impure thought, could invite disaster. The priesthood was vast. The Shangu were administrators. The Gala priests, mourners and singers of lamentation, often men who took on feminine roles to serve Inanna, dancing in ecstasy, reflecting the fluid nature of her divinity. The Lagar supervised daily routines. The Gudu purified. The Na made sacred music. And then there was the Entu, the high priestess. In cities like she served Nanna, the moon god. Often a royal daughter, she united heaven and earth in a single role. She managed land, led rituals, and held political influence. Her duties weren't symbolic, they were vital. The city's prosperity was thought to rest on her sacred relationship with the god. Each day began before sunrise. The god's chamber was swept clean, pure water sprinkled, incense lit. The statue bathed, anointed with oils, dressed in gold-threaded garments, crowned with a diadem. Then came the feast. Fresh bread, dates, beer, choice meats. The god was believed to absorb the meal's essence. The leftovers went to temple staff, the poor, and travelers, creating a sacred bond between deity and people. At dusk, the ritual repeated. Cleansing, feeding, music, until the god slept again. The statue wasn't symbolic. It was the god, seeing through its eyes, hearing through its ears. Neglect was unthinkable. Cosmic collapse could follow. Seasonal festivals lit the calendar. Based on lunar alignments, they marked harvests, mythic anniversaries, and transitions of cosmic power. Cities transformed. Porches lined streets. Offerings poured in. Statues paraded. Processions chanted and danced. The gods walked among their people, and they didn't just recite myths. They lived them. The sacred marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi, the descent into the underworld, the birth of kingship. These weren't plays, they were cosmic reenactments. Ritual magic meant to sustain reality. Animal sacrifice was rare but sacred. Pure animals were adorned and thanked before being sacrificed. Their blood life itself offered to the gods. Their meat shared. Death, in this act, brought renewal. In purification rites, substitute figures, even symbolic humans, bore the community's misfortune and were cast away. A ritual reset. A cleansing of spirit and space. A realignment with the divine. The gods spoke through signs never direct, but always present. So the priests practiced divination, reading stars, watching birds, observing oil in water. But most revered of all was hepatoscopy, liver reading. The liver, removed from a sacrificed sheep, was read like a divine book. Its bumps, colors, and shapes were matched to clay models' omen tablets. This was not superstition. This was statecraft. Kings consulted livers before war, before marriage, before any great act. All of this, the dressing, the chants, the offerings, the omens, was not optional. It was the mechanism of the world. If done well, the gods were pleased, the rivers gentle, the harvests full. If neglected, chaos surged, floods, disease, war. Ritual was maintenance. The priests, janitors of the cosmos, kept the universe from falling apart. Yet this sacred world wasn't only for priests. Ordinary people played their part, offering grain, burning incense, praying to household gods, making figurines, whispering spells. Life was not separate from faith. It was faith. There was no secular. Every act, planting, birthing, mourning, pulsed with divine meaning. In the next chapter, we leave behind temple courtyards and sacred chants and enter a haunting memory. The Great Flood. A tale of divine judgment, a man, a boat, and the fragile seed of life. The origin of Ziusudra. The roots of a story echoed through the Hebrew Bible and beyond. Chapter 6. The Sumerian Flood. When the gods sent the waters, there are stories so ancient, so deeply embedded in the fabric of human memory, that they seem to echo from the beginning of time itself. Tales told not once, but again and again, in temples, in deserts, in mountain caves, and along riverbanks whispered in different tongues, dressed in different gods, yet always familiar. The tale of a great flood is one of these stories. It appears in the cracked clay of Sumer, in the chants of Babylon, in the scrolls of the Hebrews, the verses of the Quran, and in the folklore of distant peoples who never saw the twin rivers of Mesopotamia, yet somehow dreamed the same drowning dream. This is not coincidence. This is legacy. This is myth not as fiction, but as memory made sacred. And in the land between the rivers where writing was first born and cities first stood, we find the oldest version of all. The flood myth, as told by the Sumerians, is not just a tale of punishment or disaster. It is a revelation of divine emotion. It is a story of cosmic imbalance, of grief, of mercy, and of rebirth. And at its heart stands a quiet man, a listener, named Ziusudra. In the earliest days, the gods created humans not out of kindness, but from necessity. The divine assembly, tired of shaping the world with their own hands, formed mankind to carry the burden to dig canals, cultivate fields, raise temples, cook food, and offer daily sacrifices. Mortals were to be the laborers of the gods, caretakers of creation, the servants of divine will. At first, all was well. Cities rose, fields blossomed, the gods rested. But the humans multiplied. They filled the land with their footsteps and filled the air with their voices. Children cried, merchants shouted, drums pounded, festivals sang through the night. The divine quiet, so treasured by the gods, was gone, and none was more disturbed than Enlil. Lord of the wind, god of breath and storm, ruler of decrees, he found no peace. The sound of humanity rose like smoke, like bees in a hive, like thunder with no end. Enlil grew angry, deeply, dangerously angry. He summoned the Inanna, the great gods of heaven and earth. Together, they debated the fate of their creation. And in the end, they made a terrible decision. Humanity must be destroyed, not with flame, not with plague, but with water, with a flood so vast, so relentless, that it would erase mankind entirely. A reset, a silence restored. But one god was troubled. Enki, god of water, of wisdom, of life itself, could not bear the thought of every human soul lost. Among the mortals, he saw one man who listened. One man who walked with humility, who honored the gods not out of fear, but reverence. Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, a city nestled along the Euphrates. He was a priest, a ruler, and most importantly, a man of peace, of stillness, of quiet understanding. Enki could not defy the divine council openly, so he whispered. He whispered through the reeds along the river, through the walls of Ziusudra's small sanctuary, through dreams that came like visions, thick with warning. The message was clear. Build a boat. Not just any vessel, but a great ark, long, sealed, and roofed, strong enough to survive the fury of the gods. Inside, place your family, bring animals, food, seeds of every living thing. The flood is coming, Enki warned, and it will not spare the innocent from the guilty. Ziusudra obeyed. He built as instructed. He prepared in silence, even as the skies remained clear and the rivers calm. He gathered, measured, and waited. Then the heavens shifted. Clouds rolled in, black and heavy. The wind howled across the plain. The sun disappeared, and the rain came. It did not fall, it crashed. In torrents, in waves, in a wall of skyfall that knew no mercy. The rivers swelled and broke their banks. The earth groaned under the weight of water. Fields vanished. Cities crumbled. Ziggurats disappeared beneath the foam. 7 days and 7 nights the world drowned. The noise of humanity was replaced by the roar of water, and then by silence. Even the gods grew afraid. From their heavenly thrones they watched and trembled. In one account, they are said to huddle together like frightened dogs overwhelmed by the devastation they had unleashed. Ereshkigal's underworld overflowed. The dead came by the thousands. The gates could not hold them. It was a silence of grief, a mourning the size of the world. Then, the rain stopped. The winds fell still. The waters sighed and began to lower. In his sealed ark, Ziusudra waited. When the silence became unbearable, he opened a hatch. Light spilled in blinding, golden, empty. The world was water and sky, nothing else. He released a bird. It returned, finding no perch. He waited and released another. This time, it did not return. Hope fluttered on the wind. Eventually, the great boat settled on a mountain. Ziusudra stepped out. The world was still, wet, cleansed, empty, waiting. He built an altar and gave thanks. The smoke of his sacrifice rose like a ribbon into the sky. The gods watched and repented. Enlil, moved by Ziusudra's devotion, granted him eternal life, a reward for righteousness, a symbol of new beginnings. The story of Ziusudra is the first flood myth ever written, recorded around 2100 BCE on clay tablets in Sumer. But it did not end there. The Babylonians retold it through Atrahasis. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim became the survivor. The story changed, but it stayed the same. From these ancient roots, the tale flowed outward, into the story of Noah, into Islamic scripture, into Hindu tradition, into the myths of Mesoamerica and the Pacific. A memory, perhaps, of a real flood, or perhaps something deeper, a story our ancestors needed to tell. A ritual of renewal, when the world must be washed clean before it begins again. To the Sumerians, this myth was not metaphor. It was real. It was a warning. Every year, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded, sometimes gently, sometimes with fury. The rivers gave life, but they also took it away. This story explained that danger. It gave it shape. It offered reason. It showed that even the gods could regret, that mercy could survive judgment, that a humble man could be the vessel for the future of the world. Ziusudra was not chosen for strength or conquest. He was chosen for listening, for stillness, for obedience to the quiet wisdom of the divine. This story became sacred. It was read aloud in temples, etched onto thousands of tablets. It passed from empire to empire. Its meaning endured. And today, it still speaks. It asks us, what causes collapse? What must be washed away? What kind of person survives the flood? In the next chapter, we return from myth to power, to the kings who claimed divine favor, to the crowns, temples, and sacred objects that held the fate of cities. We explore kingship and the divine right to rule. Chapter 7. Kingship and Divine Rule. The gift of the gods. In the land between the rivers, where cities rose from clay and prayers echoed through temple courts, power was never merely a human affair. It did not arise from the ambitions of men or the strength of their armies, nor was it a matter of inheritance or bloodline alone. Power to the Sumerians, was something far greater. It was sacred. It was celestial. It was a gift, bestowed by the gods and entrusted to mortal hands, not as a privilege, but as a responsibility. The Sumerians believed that kingship itself had once descended from heaven. It was not invented by human effort, but handed down like a divine tool, a heavenly design meant to bring order to a world born from chaos. According to their oldest records, the first city to receive this gift was Eridu, the most ancient of Sumerian settlements, nestled in the southern marshes. From there, kingship passed from city to city like a flame passed from torch to torch. Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, each taking its turn as the center of the world until the great flood came and washed the slate clean. This notion is preserved in one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient world, the Sumerian king list. Part myth, part history, it tells of rulers who reigned for thousands of years, who held dominion over vast realms, in a time when the gods still walked among men. These were not ordinary kings. They were semi-divine, larger than life, the bridge between heaven and earth. And after the flood, when the world began again, the kingship was said to descend once more, this time to the city of Kish, and from there to the rest of Mesopotamia. But to understand what kingship truly meant in Sumer, we must look beyond names and numbers. A king was not simply a warrior or a judge. He was the earthly embodiment of cosmic balance. He stood at the junction between gods and people, charged with maintaining the fragile harmony that sustained city life. He was the keeper of justice, the protector of temples, the one who offered sacrifices on behalf of his people. His role was deeply spiritual, and his power was justified not by conquest, but by the favor of the gods. This divine favor was not a metaphor. It was a ritual reality. When a new king came to power, he would travel to the holy city of Nippur, the spiritual heart of Sumer, where the great temple of Enlil, lord of air and fate, towered above the city. There, through solemn ceremony and offerings, he would seek confirmation of his rule. Only when Enlil's blessing was received could the king claim to rule with legitimacy. Without it, he was nothing more than a man in a robe. And this was not the only sacred rite a king had to perform. Throughout his reign, he would be responsible for observing omens, consulting diviners, and renewing his vows to the gods through seasonal rituals. His role was not fixed by his will alone. It had to be continually affirmed by the heavens. The gods gave power, but they could also withdraw it. At the core of this divine rule was a mysterious concept known as the me. These were not commandments or moral codes in the modern sense, but the fundamental building blocks of reality, decrees from the gods that governed every aspect of existence. There were me for kingship, for truth, for agriculture, for song, for war, for prostitution, for weaving, for speech. Each domain of life had its me, and each me had to be respected, invoked, and properly used. In the hands of a righteous king, the me created order, prosperity, and peace. But when misused or neglected, they could unravel the world. That is why kings were not just rulers, they were caretakers of sacred knowledge, protectors of the divine design. This relationship between kingship and the me is beautifully illustrated in the myth of Inanna and Enki. In the tale, Inanna, goddess of love and war, travels to Enki's temple in Eridu, where the me are kept hidden beneath the waters of the deep. She praises him, drinks with him, flatters him, and while he is drunk, she persuades him to gift her the me. over 100 of them. She gathers them and flees to her city, Uruk, carrying the power of civilization in her hands. Enki, awakening sober, regrets his decision and sends emissaries to retrieve them. But Inanna outwits them all. She brings them safely to Uruk, and from that day, Uruk becomes a beacon of culture and divine authority. This myth is more than a story. It speaks to the Sumerian understanding that power, even when divine, must be held by those capable of wielding it wisely. The gods may possess the gifts, but it is through the cities, through kings and priests, that these gifts are manifested in the world. But kingship was not always stable. When a city fell, it was often seen not as a military loss, but a sign that its king had lost divine favor. When temples were desecrated or statues defaced, it was not merely political, it was theological. To defeat a king was to demonstrate that his god had abandoned him. And yet, despite this fragility, kingship endured. It provided the backbone of Mesopotamian civilization, structuring its cities, shaping its economies, and anchoring its myths. Kings were builders of ziggurats, patrons of scribes, organizers of labor, commanders of armies. But above all, they were servants of the gods, kneeling before the altars, offering the smoke of incense and the blood of lambs, praying not just for victory, but for balance. One of the finest examples of this divine kingship is Ur-Nammu, ruler of Ur, around 2100 BCE. He issued one of the world's earliest law codes, long before Hammurabi, written in Sumerian and preserved on tablets. In it, he frames justice, not as his invention, but as a reflection of divine will. His code punishes theft, violence, and dishonesty, but it also protects the poor and the vulnerable. To govern well was to rule as the gods would rule, with firmness, yes, but also with wisdom and care. Even in death, kings remained close to the divine. Royal tombs in Ur, uncovered by archaeologists, reveal elaborate burials filled with treasures, lyres, gold cups, weapons, seals, suggesting that the king's journey continued into the afterlife. In some cases, attendants were buried alongside the ruler, continuing their service in the world beyond. Death was not an end, but a passage to a sacred continuation of the king's cosmic role. To the Sumerians, then, kingship was not just a human institution, it was an axis around which heaven and earth revolved. The king was a man, but in moments of ritual and sacrifice, in the silence of temple halls and the roar of battlefield processions, he stood as something more, a channel, a vessel, a living point of contact between the mortal and the eternal. In our next chapter, we meet the Queen of Heaven, the morning and evening star, the goddess of love and of war, of creation and destruction. Her name was Inanna, and through her, the Sumerians glimpsed the untamed power of life itself. Chapter 8. Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and the underworld. In the dazzling pantheon of Sumerian gods, no figure looms more mysteriously radiant than Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, the morning and evening star, the goddess of love, of war, of fertility and power, of passion and destruction. She was not merely worshipped. She was feared, adored, sung to, and invoked at times of both celebration and catastrophe. Inanna was paradox made divine, a deity who held the power to bring life into bloom, and just as swiftly to tear it away. She was known by many names across Mesopotamia. The Akkadians would call her Ishtar, and her worship would stretch far beyond Sumer's borders, resonating through the mythologies of Babylon, Assyria, and even distant Canaan. But it was in Sumer that her myth first took root, where clay tablets inscribed with her stories, some tender, some terrifying, would survive millennia to whisper her legacy to us now. Inanna stood at the crossroads of opposing forces. She was both seductress and soldier, comforter and destroyer, lover and executioner. She ruled over the domain of love and sensuality, yet marched at the front of armies with blood on her hands. She embodied the cycles of nature and the violence of human ambition. And through her, the Sumerians explored the deep truths of existence, love and conflict, death and rebirth, ascent and descent. According to myth, Inanna was the daughter of the moon god Nanna and the sky god Anu, or in some traditions, of Enlil, or even Enki. Like much in Sumerian theology, her genealogy shifted with time and region, but her prominence remained constant. From an early age, she was associated with the planet Venus, which blazes briefly in the morning sky before disappearing, only to return again at dusk. This celestial rhythm echoed her own myths of descent and return, of loss and resurgence, of flickering light and encroaching shadow. Her symbols were powerful and unmistakable. The 8-pointed star, often surrounded by rays, marked her presence. Lions, fierce and noble, were her sacred animals. And like the gods of war that would come after her in distant lands, she was depicted with weapons adorning her shoulders, with storms at her back, and determination in her eyes. Inanna was not merely a distant celestial force. She was intimately tied to Uruk, one of the earliest and most influential cities in Sumer. Her great temple, the Inanna, meaning House of Heaven, dominated the city's sacred quarter. Within its walls, priestesses and servants of the goddess enacted rituals, composed hymns, and preserved her myths. To worship Inanna was to embrace complexity. Her festivals were lavish and emotional, filled with music, dancing, lamentation, and ecstatic devotion. Offerings of food, perfume, and precious objects were laid before her statue. In her honor, sacred marriages were sometimes ritually performed. Symbolic unions between the king and a high priestess representing the goddess herself, reenacting her divine coupling with Dumuzi, her beloved shepherd consort. Through these rites, Inanna's fertility was invoked not just for human reproduction, but for the prosperity of the land itself. Crops, livestock, and rivers were believed to respond to her pleasure. But just as swiftly, her wrath could bring drought, devastation, or war. Of all her myths, the most haunting and profound is that of Inanna's descent into the Underworld, a tale that echoes across time as one of the earliest known stories of death and return, a foundational myth of seasonal cycles and cosmic balance. The story begins with Inanna choosing to descend into Kua, the great below, the domain of her dark sister, Ereshkigal. She does not descend in fear or weakness, but with pride and intent. She wears her finest garments, her crown, her jewelry, her breastplate, her ceremonial robes. At each of the 7 gates of the Underworld, she is stripped of one adornment, layer by layer, until she arrives before her sister, naked and bowed. Why does she descend? The text is enigmatic. Some versions suggest she sought to extend her power. Others imply a longing to mourn Ereshkigal's dead husband. But what follows is unmistakable. Inanna is judged, struck down, and killed. Her corpse is hung on a hook. The Queen of Heaven becomes a lifeless husk. The world above reacts. Life withers. Crops cease to grow. Passion drains from the people. The absence of Inanna is the absence of vitality itself. 3 days pass, then 3 more, and finally intervention comes. The god Enki, moved to restore balance, crafts two strange, genderless creatures from the dirt beneath his fingernails. These beings descend into the underworld and mourn with Ereshkigal, mirroring her grief until she softens. As a reward, they ask for Inanna's body. Ereshkigal relents, but return is never simple. A rule is spoken. One who leaves the underworld must send another in their place. And so begins the final turn of the tale. Inanna rises, but she is pursued by demons who demand a substitute. Eventually, she finds Dumuzi, her beloved, seated on a throne, draped in finery, unmoved by her absence. Enraged, she chooses him. He will descend in her place. Later traditions soften the outcome. Dumuzi's sister volunteers to share the burden. The two siblings trade seasons sown in the world of the living, the other in the realm of the dead. And thus, through this myth, the Sumerians explain the turning of the year, the cycles of abundance and barrenness, of joy and mourning. Inanna's character defied simplification. She was sensual and intimate, yet also brutal and volatile. Her myths are filled with erotic poetry, with desire and longing, yet also with conquest and cruelty. In one hymn, she is praised as a storm of battle. You ride in the flood, storm, destroyer of rebel lands, queen of all powers, clothed in terror. She does not merely inspire warriors, she marches with them. In times of war, her favor was sought in blood, yet she also comforted, healed, and sang lullabies to kings. To serve Inanna was to embrace contradiction. To understand her was to understand that life is never only gentle or fierce, it is always both. Inanna's influence would ripple outward through the centuries. As Ishtar, she would rule Babylon and Nineveh. Her face would be carved in stone, painted on walls, her hymns translated into new tongues. And even beyond Mesopotamia, echoes of her could be heard in Aphrodite, in Venus, in the countless goddesses who mingled love with power. Yet none bore quite the same spark. Inanna was not merely divine, she was alive. She loved, she mourned, she descended into darkness and returned bearing scars. She was the goddess who died, the goddess who rose, the goddess who chose. In her, the Sumerians saw themselves, their passions, their hungers, their grief, and their hope. In our next chapter, we follow Inanna's footsteps into the very realm she once braved. We step through the gates of the underworld, not as gods, but as mortal sand, discover how the Sumerians imagined death, the afterlife, and the soul's long, silent journey beyond the veil. Chapter 9. Ereshkigal and the Underworld. The City of No Return. Long before the world was carved by cities and crowned with ziggurats, long before kings ruled beneath the gaze of the gods, the Sumerians told of a deeper realm, one untouched by sunlight, sealed behind 7 gates, and ruled not by a warrior or priest, but by a silent queen who sat alone upon a throne of shadow. This was the Kur, the great below, a land from which no traveler returns, where dust is the bread and clay the meat, and where the soul, once vibrant, drifts without memory, name, or hope. The Sumerians did not imagine death as punishment, nor reward. There were no heavenly realms for the righteous, no fires for the wicked. Instead, death was a leveling wind. It made no distinction between beggar and king, priest and shepherd. All descended into the same dim cavern, and all passed beneath the quiet dominion of Ereshkigal, Queen of the Underworld. Her name means Queen of the Great Earth, and she is among the most enigmatic and haunting deities in the Sumerian cosmos. Sister to Inanna, yet her mirror, opposite in nearly every way. If Inanna was the morning star, radiant and chaotic, then Ereshkigal was the black sky after sunset still, watchful, inevitable. She ruled alone. No court surrounded her, no songs praised her. While other gods gathered in grand assemblies and banquets above, Ereshkigal remained in the depths, presiding over a kingdom of dust and forgotten names. Kur was not a hell of flames or torments. It was not evil, but it was chilling in its silence. A cavernous land beneath the mountains, far removed from the waters of life and the warmth of the sun. To enter Kur was to be cut off from breath, from kin, from the divine. And in this place, the dead did not remember who they were. Their bodies became shadows, their voices whispers. They ate the dirt of the earth and drank from bowls of sorrow. And yet, this was not punishment. This was simply the cost of being mortal. To the Sumerians, this understanding of death was woven into the fabric of life itself. Even the mightiest king, even the holiest priest, even the most beloved child would one day make that descent. And when they did, they would pass through the 7 gates of the underworld, each one stripping away a piece of their earthly identity, jewelry, titles, power, pride, until nothing remained but the soul, naked and weightless before Ereshkigal's throne. Because this realm awaited all, the living clung to ritual. Burial in Sumer was not merely tradition, it was necessity. The dead were washed, anointed, wrapped in cloth. Offerings were made, bread, beer, oil, even tools and figurines. To die without burial, to die forgotten, was to risk unrest in the afterlife, or worse, to linger uneasily between the worlds. In ancient cemeteries like those uncovered at archaeologists have found not only royal tombs, but graves of ordinary citizens, each with tokens meant to ease the transition. In the royal tombs of the bodies of guards and attendants were buried alongside queens, suggesting that in the Sumerian imagination, some followed their rulers, even into death, not as slaves, but as companions, into the shadowed realm. There was fear, yes, but there was also acceptance. Death, for the Sumerians, was not a door to another kind of life. It was the return to silence, and so they honored it with solemn care, lest the boundary between the worlds grow thin. Unlike the vibrant and dramatic myths of her sister Inanna, Ereshkigal's stories are sparse, veiled, and often tragic. Yet in one myth, perhaps the most famous in all Sumerian lore, Ereshkigal steps into the light, not as villain or shadow, but as sovereign. When Inanna descends into the underworld, she is not welcomed. Ereshkigal commands her guards to strip Inanna at each gate, and finally, when the Queen of Heaven stands before her sister, naked and bowed, Ereshkigal strikes her dead. This act may seem cruel, but within the myth, it is not portrayed as evil. It is inevitable. No one enters the underworld and leaves unchanged. Even gods are not exempt from its laws. The death of Inanna is not a crime. It is balance. And yet, the underworld is not joyless. Ereshkigal too feels pain. When her husband, the god Gugalana, dies, she is overcome with grief. So deep is her mourning that when strange beings come to comfort her, neither gods nor humans softens. She offers them a gift, and they ask for Inanna's body. Here, Ereshkigal does not rage. She does not scheme. She grants the request. There is complexity in her silence. She is not heartless, but she is not warm. She represents the necessity of limits, of endings, of what cannot be reversed. The power of Ereshkigal is that she does not seek power. She does not ride into battle. She does not demand praise, and yet she holds sway over all. Even gods dread her realm. In later myths, her role fades, replaced by darker visions of the afterlife from Babylonian and Assyrian influence. But in Sumer, Ereshkigal was not evil. She was the end that comes to all. She was the truth that underlies every song, every harvest, every kiss and coronation. And because of her, life was precious. From the depths of the underworld, the Sumerians told stories not to frighten but to remember the ones lost, to remember the silence that waits for every living soul, and to remember that within that silence dwelled not a monster but a queen, robed in black, seated on a throne of stone, her gaze fixed not on vengeance but on eternity. And so ends the journey through the land of no return. But not all myths dwell in sorrow. Some rise like the wind from distant mountains. In our next chapter, we turn to one such Talitha saga of a man who defied death, sought the gods, and carved his name into eternity. The greatest hero of Sumer, Gilgamesh. Chapter 10. Myths of Heroes. Gilgamesh and the Search for Immortality. In a time when gods still walked among mortals, and the boundary between legend and history had not yet hardened into stone, the Sumerians told of a man who was more than a man. He was 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal. A king not born, but shaped by divine will, by sorrow, and by the relentless questioning of his own soul. His name was Gilgamesh, and his story became the greatest epic of the ancient world. Before Homer sang of Achilles or Odysseus, before Moses climbed his mountain, before the Mahabharata thundered through the Ganges Valley, there was the epic of Gilgamesh, etched into clay, line by line, in the flowing script of cuneiform. His tale would outlast empires. A story not only of conquest and strength, but of grief, of love, and of that most human longing, the desire to escape death. Gilgamesh ruled in Uruk, the very city where temples rose like mountains, and the White Temple crowned the high ziggurat. He was a builder, a warrior, a king of immense power. So mighty was his reign that the walls of Uruk, said to have been laid by his own hand, became the very symbol of civilization's triumph over chaos. But Gilgamesh was no gentle shepherd of his people. At first, he ruled with cruelty, seizing what he pleased, claiming brides, breaking laws, placing his will above all. The people of Uruk cried out to the gods for deliverance, and the gods answered not with thunder or plague, but with a rival. From clay and divine breath, the gods shaped a wild man named Enkidu. Hairy, strong, and free, he lived with the beasts of the steppe, drinking at their watering holes, running with the gazelle, knowing neither city nor sin. To civilize him, a sacred woman was sent, Shamhat, a priestess of the temple. Through 6 days and 7 nights of love, Enkidu was transformed. He lost his innocence, but gained understanding. He could no longer run with the animals now they fled from him, and so he walked toward Uruk, toward destiny, and toward his fated brother. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu met, they did not embrace, they fought. The clash shook the foundations of Uruk. 2 titans, equals in strength, wrestled through streets and temples until, at last, Gilgamesh prevailed. But from that struggle, something unexpected was born: friendship. They became inseparable, brothers in arms, mirrors to one another. Together, they sought glory not for conquest alone, but for meaning. And so they set out on a quest beyond the walls of Uruk. To the distant cedar forest, sacred to the gods, they marched. There stood Humbaba, the monstrous guardian appointed by Enlil. His breath was fire, his voice thunder, his gaze death. Still, Gilgamesh and Enkidu entered the woods. They faced the beast together, prayed to Shamash the sun god, and slew Humbaba with sword and courage. The forest trembled, the heavens stirred. They had defied a god's will, and the price would come. Their fame grew, but so did divine wrath. When Gilgamesh spurned the goddess Inanna, rejecting her love and insulting her past lovers, unleashed the bull of heaven. Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed the bull, shaking the balance of heaven and earth. The gods met in council. A decision was made. Not both could live. And so Enkidu fell ill, slow, wasting sickness, not from battle, but from judgment. As he lay dying, he cursed the day of his birth. He cursed the hunter who had found him, the woman who had loved him, and the gods who had shaped his end. But before he died, he made peace. And in his final breath, he gave Gilgamesh the greatest gift, grief. Shattered by Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh was changed. His strength remained, but his heart was hollow. He could no longer laugh, could no longer rest. For the first time, he understood that he too would die. And so, like many who have lost what they love, he sought what he could never hold: eternal life. He journeyed across deserts, climbed mountains, crossed the waters of death. His goal was to find Utnapishtim, the immortal man who had survived the great flood, granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh found him and listened to a tale of catastrophe and salvation. Utnapishtim spoke of the time when the gods had grown tired of humanity's noise and corruption. He told of how Enki, the god of wisdom, whispered a warning to him through a reed wall, of how he built an ark sealed with pitch and saved not only his family, but the animals of the world, of how, after the deluge, the gods repented their destruction and granted him and his wife eternal life, not as reward, but as a relic. To Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim offered a final test, to stay awake for 7 nights, but the hero failed sleep, taking him as surely as death would. And so, the secret of immortality was denied. As a gesture, Utnapishtim revealed one final hopia plant of renewal at the bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh found it, but as he bathed, a serpent stole it away. The gift was lost. Empty-handed, Gilgamesh returned to Uruk. Older, wiser, no longer seeking to conquer death, but to understand it. He stood before the walls of his city, those same walls he had once built in pride. Now, he saw them differently, not as monuments to his power, but as symbols of civilization itself. Order against chaos, memory against forgetting. And so the story ends not in triumph, but in acceptance. Gilgamesh could not escape death, but he could leave behind a name, a tale, a city, a story carved in clay and carried by wind across thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest surviving work of literature in human history. Yet it speaks of the same questions we ask today. Why do we die? What remains of us? And how do we live, knowing that all things end? It is a story of friendship, sorrow, courage, and humility. And it echoes still through every myth of heroes, every tale of kings, every heart that mourns a loss. Chapter 11. Decline and Legacy of Sumer. Echoes across time. By the close of the 3rd millennium BCE, the once glorious cities of Sumer, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu stood, like aged monarchs under a dimming sky. Their ziggurats still rose toward the heavens, their canals still wove through the plains, and the hymns to the gods still echoed in temple halls. But the Golden Age was passing, and the foundations of the world's first great civilization began to tremble under the weight of time, war, and change. The decline of Sumer was not sudden not to collapse, but a slow unraveling drawn out over centuries. And it was not caused by a single blow, but by a chorus of forces, both natural and human, that chipped away at its once mighty heart. The land that had once nourished cities with its dark, fertile silt began to betray them. Over centuries of intensive farming, the water brought by irrigation canals left behind invisible salts. With each season, the soil grew whiter, harder, less generous. Crops dwindled, fields lay fallow. The grain that had once fed empires now struggled to feed its cities. Meanwhile, the great rivers, the lifeblood of the region, shifted their courses. Canals dried. New floods struck where none had before. Nature, once mastered by human hands, began to slip free of its bonds. The Sumerians had built their world between two rivers, but rivers are restless things. As Sumer weakened from within, pressures mounted from beyond its borders. To the northwest, the Akkadians had already surged forth in the 24th century BCE under Sargon the Great, creating an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Though Akkad borrowed deeply from Sumerian language, religion, and administration, its rule signaled the end of Sumer's political independence. Later, new waves came. The Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, fierce and unpredictable. Then the Elamites from the east, and later still, the Amorites, a Semitic people who would leave their own mark. Each incursion brought more than violence. It brought change. Rulers rose, who no longer spoke Sumerian as their native tongue. New cities, like Babylon, began to rise in influence, drawing power away from ancient centers like Ur and Eridu. The Sumerians, once the shapers of cities and kingship, found themselves folded into other realms, their legacy dispersed like clay dust in the wind. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Sumerian language, so unique in structure and so ancient in origin, was no longer spoken in the streets. Akkadian had taken its place as the language of daily life, of politics and commerce. But Sumerian did not vanish. It became a language of scholars and priests, preserved in temple schools and scribal academies. Like Latin in medieval Europe, it became a tongue of sacred knowledge, a vehicle for ritual, law, and divine speech. The myths, hymns, and epics continued to be copied long after the last native speaker had fallen silent. In this way, Sumer lived on, its voice faint, but never truly gone. Though their cities crumbled and their names faded from maps, the Sumerians left behind a cultural bedrock upon which much of later Mesopotamian and even global civilization would rest. Writing, their greatest invention, would be adopted and adapted across the ancient Near East. Cuneiform would record Babylonian laws, Assyrian conquests, and Hittite treaties. The clay tablet, humble yet immortal, would become the eternal page. Kingship, as divine appointment, persisted in Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. The idea that rulers governed by the favor of gods would echo through the ages, from pharaohs of Egypt to medieval Christian monarchs claiming the divine right to rule. The Pantheon, though reshaped, endured. Inanna became Ishtar. Enlil was merged into Marduk. The Sumerian gods did not die, they evolved, absorbed into new stories, new empires, new tongues. Their myths, especially that of Gilgamesh, traveled vast distances. Fragments of the epic would be found from Turkey to Palestine. And in some of those flood-storious tales of divine wrath, arcs, and survivors, we glimpse ancestral echoes that would find their way into later sacred texts. One of the last great flourishes of Sumerian culture came under the third dynasty of around 2100 BCE. This dynasty sought to revive Sumerian glory, standardizing laws, reasserting divine kingship, and building massive temple complexes. Ur-Nammu and his successors ruled wisely, leaving behind ziggurats, hymns, and records of surprisingly modern governance. But even this renaissance could not hold back the tide. By around 2004 BCE, fell to Elamite invaders, and the light of independent Sumer was extinguished. Yet even as the cities fell silent, their memory remained. What does it mean for a civilization to die? Not all deaths are erasures. Some are transformations. The Sumerians may no longer have called themselves by name, but their influence radiated outward into Babylon, into Nineveh, into the very concept of urban life. Their beliefs seeded mythologies. Their words became script. Their temples became blueprints for sacred architecture across cultures. Even their questions about life, death, gods, and meaning are the same questions we still ask. The cradle of civilization did not vanish. It simply passed its flame to other hands. Chapter 12. Conclusion. The echo of Sumer in our modern world. Long ago, between the Tigris and Euphrates, a quiet miracle unfolded. From the rich floodplains of southern Mesopotamia rose the first cities, temples, and tablets of memory. Here, in the land the Greeks would call Mesopotamia, meaning simply between rivers, humanity took its first organized steps into history. The Sumerians built with mud and belief, with reed and resolve. They gave structure to chaos, order to floods, and meaning to the unpredictable rhythms of life. And though their cities have long since returned to dust, and their gods have fallen silent, their fingerprints remain pressed into the clay of all that followed. The systems we inherit today, writing, legal codes, measurement, timekeeping, did not arrive as sudden gifts of modernity. They were forged in the firelit halls of Uruk, in the records of scribes at Lagash, in the chants of temple priests, and the decrees of kings claiming divine sanction. The Sumerians divided hours into 60 parts, tracked stars across the sky, and asked the gods to bless their crops and protect their children. They wrote not to entertain, but to indiretto, create memory that could not be erased by wind or war. Even now, as we tap out thoughts on glowing screens, we walk paths first carved with a stylus pressed into wet clay. Their myths, too, remain more than echoes. Gilgamesh's search for immortality still speaks to our longing for permanence in a world shaped by impermanence. Inanna's descent into the underworld is not just a tale of gods, but a timeless metaphor for loss, transformation, and rebirth. These stories endured not because they were perfect, but because they were true to something eternal in user, fear of death, our hunger for meaning, our awe at the forces that govern existence. And so, from cuneiform tablets to sacred texts, from ancient rituals to modern storytelling, Sumer's voice continues to whisper through the corridors of time. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Sumer is not what they built or believed, but what they began. They began the city. They began the written word. They began the notion that human life could be ordered, remembered, interpreted, and passed on. They lit the first torch of civilization, and that flame, carried forward by Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, and countless others, still burns, not always visibly, not always consciously, but in the invisible frameworks that govern our days, in the language of laws and logic, in the spiritual questions that trouble and elevate the soul. The Sumerians are there. Civilizations rise and fall, names change, gods are forgotten, but some ideas become so woven into the fabric of the world that they outlive even the memory of their makers. The Sumerians may have vanished from the earth, but they endure in spirit in the streets of every city, in the script of every book, in the structure of every society that dares to ask, how do we live together? And why are we here? And so, as we close this journey into the world's first great civilization, we do not say goodbye to Sumer. We simply look around and realize we never left.